the goal would be for me to put forward a couple of theses regarding societal changes post-COVID. And one thesis will be that the crisis has been a sort of catalyst both for technological change, especially in the realm of digitalization and telecommunication technologies and the adoption of those. But it has also ushered in new forms of social interaction, and particularly so in the field of work, of professions, of making a living, also of teaching, of course, and studying to a degree. So we're in a sense living that experience right now in the context of a virtual lecture. And these techno-social changes and ramifications of COVID have had, I think, or will have to a degree in the future, political implications that we need to get thinking about. Issues to do with technological power, issues to do with anxieties about the role of technologies, whether they can be reconciled with societal needs, whether they replace people on the jobs and so on. They've also had, I think, political implications in terms of a push for a certain social policy response, and we've seen certainly a relatively interventionist and activistic state in the last 2 or so years, and all of this taken together has had effects and impacts on democracy as well. And I'll say some more things on these issues in due course. Okay, let's briefly recapitulate what has happened in terms of what could be called really a revolution in technology use over the last two or so years. And I've come to speak of this era as the era of virtual normality. A period of time where technologies that had long been ripe for the market and had even been used in this or that context had really had a breakthrough moment and had seen suddenly much wider adoption. Think of telecommunication technology, virtual conferencing, online payments, delivery services, but also collaborative digital work tools, projects, Slack, all these kinds of software platforms took off. Video recording of all sorts of events, be it cultural events, be it teaching events, be it public speaking and so on, got an enormous push. And many organizations, including the University of Vienna, had to really gear up and invest pretty tremendously, not only in software licenses, but also in the technical server infrastructure that the things run on. So that you can conveniently watch a lecture like this from the comfort of your home or wherever you may be, is the result of the university having acquired Zoom licenses and so on. And they'd previously been experimenting with various platforms. Moodle runs smoothly. You can now stream, you can record, you can download and upload large amounts of data, which had previously not been possible. And many organizations, many companies have adapted to that. So that has meant a breakthrough in tech adoption, not so much, mind you, a breakthrough necessarily in innovation. I think it was a time where things got adopted and people also adapted to technologies. There was not necessarily new technologies. These technologies had long been in the pipeline, and I guess we'd all been using Skype, for instance, for pretty much a decade or even more than that. But now, with some twists and some tweaks, it's pervasive in teaching and beyond. An interesting concept in that regard is the so-called hype cycle that I was reminded of repeatedly. It's a concept developed by a consulting agency called Gartner, and they try to put sort of technologies onto. I'm trying to find a point. Spotlight. There you go. On this kind of a N-shaped curve, I guess, or something of that sort, where they say technologies live through a development where you have an innovation trigger at the beginning, and then you have rising societal expectations about the technology. So, for instance, we may, I guess, big data may have seen the peak of inflations and may already be entering that kind of disillusionment phase. But certainly some sorts of robotics, autonomous vehicles may be at the peak at the moment. Augmentation technologies, brain-computer interfaces are pretty hot. 3D bioprinting, quantum computing is in the hype cycle, is early in the so-called hype cycle. And then you have a peak of inflated expectations where people think, well, this will completely change everything, overturn the world, overturn everything that we know of, followed by a disillusionment of these expectations, where people realize, well, it's not really changing that much. There's much more continuity than we thought, and people are actually only slow to adopt the things. And after some time, after having gone through what they call the trough of disillusionment, so that sort of valley down here, the technologies tend to find their niches and tend to find their users and also their user groups and their sensible kind of areas of application. So I can still remember quite well when speech recognition was something futuristic and was considered something that would in the future perhaps replace replace interpreters and do away maybe with teachers as well, and so on. So lots of hype around that. And then people figured out, well, it doesn't really work. It's very complicated. It's not that useful to be able to speak with your PC, with your desktop PC, and so on. And it went through the disillusionment phase. And increasingly now it's actually pretty common to be used on your phone, for instance, or if you communicate with Siri or Alexa or these kinds of technologies. And nobody really talks about speech recognition much anymore because it's in sort of daily use. It's conquered its niche. Okay, and the same could be said for things like cloud computing. There's a nice chart I made. So this is search interest on Google for the term cloud computing. As you can see, this actually follows really quite neatly this kind of idea of a hype cycle that we just saw before, with that inflation phase from 2008 to 2011 or so, and the peak of inflated expectations where everything was going to be in the cloud. And nowadays, nobody really talks about cloud computing, but people take it absolutely for granted. Everybody uses Google Docs or whatever, shares links, edits docs online, has their photos online, stores their videos online and so on. Everything is really in the clouds, but it's much past the hot phase. Okay, so Roy Amara, a technology scholar or expert, once said, we overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, we underestimate it in the long run, right? And that's what this hype cycle is about. And I think this is also what COVID sort of demonstrated in a sense, and it sped up some of these technology adoption processes pretty significantly. What it also sped up is the conquest, if you will, of the world by technology companies, Amazon, Zoom, Alphabet, Apple, and the likes. And you saw that these companies, at least in terms of stock market valuations, benefited tremendously. They've recently gone through some correction in that regard, but clearly the tech industry was a big winner in that context. And not only Western firms profited, and not only sort of the classic OECD countries adopted technologies pretty heavily, but also if you look beyond, China was a good example where a lot of increased use of robotics, for instance, in the industrial sector, but also in terms of hygiene applications and disinfectant robots, but also surveillance technologies and so on, got a big push during the pandemic. So tech adoption as a global phenomenon. So this was the first in my argument that the crisis has been a catalyst. It's been a catalyst for technological change. It's given us a revolution in technology use. It's also given us a revolution in terms of how we work and how we socially interact. One of the perhaps most visible and emblematic patterns that we have seen in the COVID-19 context was work from home, or what is called in the Austrian context home office. I think it's probably not a term widely used beyond the German language, but working from home at the peak of the first sort of COVID infection spikes in around March, April 2020 in Austria, more than a third of the labor force was working from home. And this declined later on, but it has never reached the level. Well, in that case, we don't have a pre-pandemic baseline, but it arguably has never reached the levels pre-pandemic. But a lot of work from home has instead, in fact, remained possible, and many companies have issued regulations and have made it possible for employees to work at home at least partially. It's quite common. I know certainly in my own circle of friends and acquaintances that people work much more from home than they previously did. Who works from home? That is also interesting. And I'm sorry, I'll have to translate these charts, but there's clear socioeconomic stratification in terms of the kinds of people who work from home. In the left-hand panel, the dark blue is the people who work from home. The green is those who have been laid off. The lighter or gray greenish is there's no change. The orange is they've been on short time work or furlough, and the red is well, they were consuming vacation or annual leave. And what the horizontal axis shows as primary education, apprentices, people with a secondary education, and people with university education. So by it's clearly stratified by education. The higher the educational attainment, the more likely people were to have worked from home. And the same goes for, that's just the same categories for income brackets. Also a bit less pronounced than the educational stratification, but clearly those with higher household incomes or higher personal incomes, I don't know which it is, you'd have to read up on that, were much more likely to be working from home during the pandemic than those on low incomes, unsurprisingly, because these people do very different jobs, notably either jobs in the service sector or more manual jobs. And also, it's quite interesting to see that, as a side note, that those who were doing short-time work, they show the opposite pattern, pretty much. Also, those who got laid off, right? So much more likely to have had a primary education than a university degree. Not so much the case in the context of income. Who works from home in terms of sectors? I just indicated that, especially people in the information and communication sector, in people in finance and insurance, in education and teaching capacities, freelancers and science-based jobs, economic services, and so on, and the public sector as well. So people in IT, 3/4 of them were working from home during the pandemic in 2020, and something in the same order of magnitude in the banking industry. If you compare that to who was put on short-time work, that was mainly the construction sector, but also people who do repairs or in commerce or work in industry or production. So clear social stratification following from that within societies, but also to an extent between societies. There's an interesting World Bank study that tried to estimate the prevalence of teleworkable jobs around the world. And what they found is they think in high income countries such as EU countries, the US, OECD countries generally, in the order of magnitude of a good third of jobs are teleworkable. If you go to upper middle income countries, that would be predominantly Asia, and Latin America, already much fewer people in low income countries. Not much more than 10% of jobs are estimated to be teleworkable, so where people could potentially work from home if the need arose. Why? Well, internet would be needed, but there's no access. That's one of the main issues here. But also the structure of the job market itself, the kinds of jobs people do. So the technological change has impacted social changes and has had social ramifications and impacts on social stratification as well. So what kind of lasting effects are to be reckoned with from a situation like that? One thing I think is that we can certainly argue that we have seen evidence for a punctuation of an equilibrium in society. During sort of normal times, one could argue, and these are metaphors borrowed from evolutionary theory, things go in small steps, incrementally. One thing leads to the next in sort of trial and error with not much revolutionary change. But sometimes a lot happens at once, and irreversibly so. An equilibrium is punctuated and then you have a new equilibrium, and something is pushed into a different mode of operation for good, essentially, without the option to jump back into the previous state. And that's, I think, there's evidence that we've seen some of that during COVID. So consider, for instance, the rise of e-commerce, the Amazon and Deliveroo and whatnot revolution. These are unfortunately slightly dated data already, but what we see is sort of a pre-pandemic gradualism, and then a big push, but not a reversal back. So to the extent that these data continue into the future, this would be evidence of people having simply adapted and learned new forms of social behavior and technology use, and are not going to go back to the status quo ante. And sorry, I should have said the red bars give you online commerce, and the gray bars give you offline commerce, so over-the-counter supermarkets, grocery shopping, and stuff like that. And the below bars would be stuff bought via online platforms and so on. And an interesting example of a lasting impact in that regard would also be, for instance, that press release from the Welsh government in the UK, where they say they take the opportunity to even set a policy goal of having a significant part of the workforce work remotely in the future, right? So that is adaptation to the extent even that it is put into a policy framework and made an explicit government goal. The Welsh government has stated its long-term ambition, quote, to see around 30% of Welsh workers working from home or near from home, including after the threat of COVID-19 lessens, right? So that's the important element here, including after the threat of COVID-19 lessens. It's a long-term goal. This would be achieved by driving changes to Wales' working culture that would give more people the choice to work in a way that helps their productivity as well as their work-life balance. And they mention things like road congestion, pollution, private car use. They'd like to reduce that, and maybe work from home could be helpful in that regard. That's an interesting development where you see the stickiness of a catalytic event like this pandemic. There's also quite good evidence from previous, especially economic and financial crises, that these can have rather unanticipated long-term effects in all sorts of ways. And I'll give you another example later in the political realm, which I find interesting, thought-provoking, and alarming. But this one is maybe even uplifting, depending on how you see the things. It's a study of the financial crisis of 2008, the so-called Great Recession. And the authors Hirschman and Kahn in 2017 find that this brought lasting technological change, and I'll just read this out from the abstract. We show that skills requirements, so the kinds of stuff that people, educational attainment and so on, that people need to do the job, in job vacancy postings, so job ads, differentially increased in places that were hit hard by the Great Recession relative to less hard hit areas. Okay, so they exploit variation in the extent of impact the Great Recession had, in that case in the US, and then they have a sort of place-based model of what happened to job vacancies post pre and post the financial crisis. These increases in skills requirements persist through at least the end of 2015 and are correlated with increases in capital investments. Okay, so firms in places where the recession hit harder were starting to look for people with higher skills. And this correlates also with evidence that they had made stronger capital investments. Okay, what is capital investment? These kinds of things, right? Machinery, these kinds of things. That's capital investment, servers, and so on. Tangibles in a factory floor, and so on. So these increases persist through at least the end of 2015 and are correlated with increases in capital investments. So what this suggests is firms upgraded their capital stock, invested in hardware and so on, and needed different kinds of labor following the Great Recession. We also find that effects are most pronounced in routine cognitive occupations. So that's further evidence, another red flag adding to that story, sort of. Less demand for routine cognitive occupation, things where you just do data entry or things like that, repetitive work, stuff that can be automated, which exhibit, quote, which exhibit relative wage growth as well. We argue, so they were paid less as well, less demand in other words. We argue that this evidence is consistent with the restructuring of production, okay? That names the child here, toward routine biased technologies and the more skilled workers that complement them, and that the Great Recession accelerated this process. Okay, so you have a financial crisis, and the financial crisis leads to a restructuring, a durable, a lasting restructuring of production, in that case in the US. And what does that mean? Different demands and requirements on the kinds of skills that people need to bring to the labor market in order to be in high demand. It's an effect that you wouldn't necessarily reckon with. It's an indirect effect, and it's an effect that can have pretty substantial and long-lasting implications for society. Consider this, for instance, in it's a CNBC article from September 14th, 2020. So sort of after half a year of the pandemic. Amazon to hire 100,000 more workers in its latest job spree this year. Amazon.com on Monday said it is recruiting 100,000 more workers to keep pace with e-commerce demand that jumped during the pandemic. It is the company's fourth hiring spree announced for the US this year. The Seattle-based company employed 876,800 people as of June 30, excluding contractors and temporary personnel. Okay, if you're following the media, some of these people may have been laid off more recently. But the kinds of numbers you read in the news, Microsoft laying off, I don't know, 10,000 people. So that's not that much considered to what, considering the expansion of the workforce in that sector in the last years. So again, this would speak to that story. There's an external shock. Society adapts and restructures ways of not only production but consumption as well in that case, and the whole system adapts to that. Okay, so what are some preliminary conclusions from that? I think we could argue that COVID-19 brought a revolution in the use of technologies, pardon me, that had long been market ready. Think the Skype, Zoom kind of example, especially in the telecommunications realm. And we could argue that society has adapted to these new forms of work, of learning, of social interaction, and that we've seen a process of cultural adaptation to that. And we also see that there's good evidence from economic history, for instance, social history, that crisis can be catalysts of structural change. So for instance, now unemployment is back to relatively low levels in Austria, pre-pandemic levels. We don't have these extreme sort of labor market crisis situation anymore, but we nevertheless see a changed workplace and changed work practices, and the workplace has remained and has been left transformed by the pandemic. Okay, so that's the sort of sociological and technoscientific angle on what has happened in the previous two and a half years. In terms of political implications, what does that mean? I'll make a few, put out a few theses, and we can discuss that in due course, and I'll invite you to share whatever your thoughts are on that in the Q&A later on. I think what we've seen, or what we need to be aware of certainly, is that this whole push towards adoption of technologies, the kinds of firms that have been empowered by the pandemic, that these raise new questions about technology and power, to put it succinctly. And in some ways, or some theorists have even said, well, technology is even some form of power. For instance, Barry Wilkinson, a British technology sociologist, wrote in the 1980s that there are things called technological decisions at the workplace happening all the time, and through all stages of technology, from innovation to adoption. And in that great book, the shop floor politics of technology, he says, this is a constant struggle over the means of control at the end of the day, and the struggle over who has authority in the workplace. This includes how is the technology planned, the use of the technology planned, what technology is selected, how is it implemented, and so on. Now, Wilkinson sees that in the context of the workplace, but of course it has ramifications beyond that as well. But consider, for instance, this nice quote from the book I just mentioned: managers, engineers, and workers become involved in orienting the impact, quote unquote, of new technology in particular directions. And there are conflicts of interest between various interested parties, okay? Not everybody in a workplace think of, I don't know, a gig economy worker, a rider for Deliveroo or Yum or whatever the name or company may be, the manager, the IT personnel, and so on. These people have potentially not always overlapping interests. And they struggle over who has control and authority in the workplace. Very often what you hear in the context of technology adoption is that people say, well, it's just the most efficient thing to do, right? We record that lecture for students to be able to listen to it whenever they want. It's a matter of convenience, of efficiency, and so on. But Wilkinson argues, well, that is mostly justificatory discourse for human-made technological decisions that have ingrained values and interests, okay? Scientific glosses, quote, which conceal or obscure the political considerations, okay? It may sound a bit paranoid, but I guess it's good to be a bit paranoid as a social scientist. And what he means is when they say, well, we need this or that machinery for the company to be more efficient, there's always, what Wilkins argues is, it's never fully determined. You could use, you have always varieties of machinery you could use. You could use Zoom, you could use a different open source software, you could store the recording in the cloud, you could store it locally, whatever. It is completely open at the end of the day how it is implemented. And the way it is, the kind of licensing arrangement, where the data is stored, how is it stored, who has access, how the support, the technical support is arranged, and so on. These are, at the end of the day, quote unquote, political decisions. Political, not in the sense of party politics, but of the politics of the workplace and of the interested parties. Again, not political parties, but parties that have different interests, groups. Okay. And lecture capture, by the way, is I think an excellent example for that, and used to be quite controversial. I recall, I'm not that old, but I do recall that there were ongoing discussions again and again at universities around the world, including also in Vienna, whether it was a good thing to record or not, and whether that sort of infringed on the copyright of the teacher, whether the teaching was sort of made redundant and abolishing itself in a sense, and so on. And when push comes to shove, these things can also matter directly politically. I recall a general strike in Britain on the a few years ago, on the occasion of a drastic pension cut in the university staff pension schemes, with strike action and picket lines and so on around the whole of the UK, and at least one university that sparked a huge sort of outcry and also media interests argued, well, the teachers may well go on strike, but we still have the recordings and of the previous year, and we'll just make them available through the e-learning platform. So that was when sort of it became clear what the underlying power struggle in a sense was there, and that the technology wasn't evil. Clearly not. It's not evil to record a lecture, but that it had clear power implications for the people involved. Okay, the fact that these things have to do with power and that they have to do also with societal change triggers anxieties. Not so much in the psychological sense of the word, but in the more socio-cultural sense. So it's, I think, sensible to say a few words on that relation between technology adoption and what could be called, following Joel Mokyr, an economic historian, technological anxiety. And Mokyr has argued that there are basically three main varieties that we see through history, and especially since the Industrial Revolution, but even predating that, are three main varieties of technological anxiety. And these are the following. First, that people are worried that technological progress could lead to technological unemployment. There's a famous text by John Maynard Keynes where he predicts that in the future almost nobody will need to work, and this will create problems in terms of people finding a meaning in life. So the idea that capital fully substitutes labor. This has been especially a concern. This is especially a concern during times of fast technological adoption and things like the certain phases of industrial revolutions. Second variety of technological anxiety revolves around the idea that technological progress has certain problematic moral effects. on society. For instance, that it is dehumanizing. The novel Play a Piano by Kurt Vonnegut would be a good example of that, perhaps. But many examples could come to mind where people argue, well, the phone, for instance, makes people stupid. It's not good for teenagers, or it destroys the social fabric even, because people stop communicating in sort of humane and desirable ways. So the idea that technology somehow corrupts society, that's the second form of technological anxiety. The third form is maybe less common in the general population, I'd argue, but you can read about nevertheless. It's perhaps more an expert discourse. It's the idea that rather than there being an age of fast technological progress, actually progress is in a sense stagnating. The idea that everything has been sort of solved and we've reached a plateau, and there's not much more to invent, for instance. This is not, I think, a widespread anxiety, but it's perhaps an anxiety among the elite or among policymakers, among, I don't know, among certain parts of the middle classes, or the expertocracy, or however you'd like to call it. The idea that the horizon is sort of reached. Certainly, if you go back into history, all sorts of people have made themselves sort of opened themselves up for ridicule with hindsight, with going out or going on record with statements along the lines of everything has been invented and there's not much more is possible. A famous one is also think of Bill Gates, perhaps, who said, "Well, the internet is not really going to take off, not really relevant." I'm not 100% sure this belongs into the third category, but anyway. Okay, so technological unemployment, a loss of humane moral interactions, and the end of progress. Speaking towards the first anxiety paradigm, which is, I think, the one that we have been most familiar with and we've seen most acutely popping up in society. Speaking to that, a recent book by another economic historian, Carl Benedict Frey, is quite thought-provoking, I think, and I'll say a few words on that. So what he argues, and this is from 2019, so it is pre-pandemic stuff. What he argues is we live in a time of increasing international competition, globalization, competition for production, and an international division of labor. And that strongly pushed automation technologies, even pre-pandemic, but also to an extent the offshoring of jobs, the outsourcing of jobs overseas. And there are manifold examples, the way the factory workplace has transformed, and so on. At the same time, while this happened, the labor movement, politically speaking, pretty much accepted, Frey argues, a kind of laissez-faire approach to automation and mechanization in exchange for demands for a stronger welfare state. So the argument being, it's okay to have technological change. It's okay to have people also being fired to a degree, but they need to get compensated, and then there needs to be a social safety net that that helps them, gives them a helping hand, also with reintegration into the job market. Overall, he argues labor unions and the whole corporatism, social partnership was tremendously weakened since the midst of the 20th century. And political representation, especially of low-skilled labor, has weakened. And I should say that Frey speaks about the US-American case, but I think it translates and applies to Europe as well. So he speaks of a multi-elite party system that has sort of where the Republicans speak towards certain business elites, but also rural elites, and the Democrats listen more to urban elites and cultural elites and so on. But who get sort of missed a little bit in between is low-skilled labor, he argues. For a long time, though, what he argues is the whole mess, sort of this disconnect between political representation and the actual pressure towards that kind of social groups was hidden and concealed through relatively decent economic growth, a housing boom, and so on. But it was laid bare in the Great Recession that I mentioned before already, which made lots of manual routine labor disappear and didn't make it, and which later didn't come back. And the same goes for mid-skilled jobs. So what's the political effect of that? Frey argues that, well, let me say one thing first. This put pressure on what he calls the industrial middle class. And he argues that this is actually, sociologically speaking, in terms of political sociology, a core pillar of any stable democracy. You cannot do without it. And this kind of class is under strong economic pressure. These kind of changes trigger worries about the future, status anxieties, and so on, particularly so in the US among the young white male labor force, and paradigmatically so in the Rust Belt. It's not that these people are necessarily objectively worse off than previous generations or even their parents' generation, but they are in a different sort of status struggle, is what Frey would argue. And this generated a sort of political resentment, which was chiefly directed against globalization overall, and particularly so trade. And interestingly, much less so against technology. Frey's explanation for that is that he argues that it is easy to dismiss anti-automation discourse as sort of Luddite and backwards looking. And it also does not appeal that much to sentiments of fairness, of more human moral intuition and the likes. So it's much easier to say, well, the Chinese are stealing our jobs than to say some kind of faceless technological process is stealing people's jobs, because most of the time the kinds of workplace technologies that you see in actual factories don't much look like a humanoid robot, right, with a face and two sort of senses as eyes, but rather different things. You see maybe examples of that on the cover page of that book. Assembly lines, I don't know, cutting machines, trimming machines, and so on. All sorts of appliances that you have a hard time sort of politically arguing against. But the use of these technologies, Frey argues, still has given this sort of political representation disconnect, has political consequences, especially in terms of polarization, increased populism, demands for populism, and oligarchic tendencies. And what's quite interesting is that he and two other scholars, Berger and Jen, show also empirically that if you look at the change in robot exposure, that's just one sort of easily measurable indicator of automation in the US over a period of time, that this correlates with the recent gains in the two-party vote share the Republicans have managed to take away. And they do a regression model, discounting or controlling for factors such as socioeconomic status and so on, and they show that at the level of, I think, districts in the US, the more robot exposure you had, the more people lean towards voting for Trump as opposed to Clinton. And they even did regression that allows you to calculate an elasticity between these two phenomena, the vote share and the automation shock. And what they argue is if automation had been quite a bit lower in a set of so-called swing states, so where the vote shares of the Republicans and the Democrats are pretty closely matched, if it had been somewhat lower, especially in some Rust Belt cases, given a very narrow general election result, Trump would not have won the election. Now, this is all up for debate, and it's a debated empirical paper, but it shows you that from a phenomenon like automation or technology use here in the industrial space, you can make very direct, almost naively direct, shockingly direct connections and draw shockingly direct lines to a potential erosion in democracy. Now, this is not all deterministic, clearly not, and Trump, of course, as you know, lost the other elections, the previous ones, even though he doesn't believe in that. But so it's not deterministic. I'm pretty sure that robot exposure has not ceased to be on an upward slope. But anyway, these things can matter certainly at the margin, and certainly if elections are close. Okay, just a few more slides in that regard. So we talked about the US. How's the situation in Europe? And I'll just throw a few bar charts at you to give you a sense of what the sort of prevalence of technological anxiety may be in Europe. And I don't then have the same kind of regression model, but there are papers also replicating that work for Europe as well, and they find correlations with populist sentiment as well. I may even have a slide on that. I'm not promising too much. We'll have to see. So this is the share of people who agree or strongly agree in 2 rounds of the Eurobarometer survey, which is a nationally representative survey project done by the European Commission regularly, and they have very special modules where they ask things of interest to the Commission. And in that case, the Commission wondered about, well, what's the prevalence of, what do people think about autonomous technologies and so on. So do robots steal people's jobs? 90 in Portugal and Spain, north of 80% in both waves. And the first one, dark blue, is 2014. Sorry, the second one, dark blue, is 2014, light blue is 2012. So this is already dated. This is 10 years old data, but I'm pretty confident not that much has changed. North of 80% say yes. That I either agree or even strongly agree with that statement. Okay. Much fewer than that, around half the population in Finland, the Netherlands, or Denmark are of that opinion. Okay. Austria is in the sort of bottom third of people being very worried about the use of technology. And we could now wonder, EL is Greece, CY is Cyprus, this is Malta, and so on. So generally speaking, more the economically weaker countries in the south of Europe have populations with more technology skepticism in that regard. And we could discuss why that is the case, but I'll give you just a few more bits of data on in terms of the social stratification of these kinds of views. In terms of gender, if it was distributed equally among the genders, this would be a 50-50. 73% of women agree with the stealing jobs statement, 68% of men. So in both cases, it's more than half, but it's more so the case among women. In terms of age, it is somewhat less the case among younger people, somewhat more among older people. Perhaps one of the strongest predictors is education. So people with low educational attainment, pretty much 4/5 of them say it's correct, robots steal people's jobs. Among those who have many years of education or are still studying, it's only 2/3. And then you have another indicator of stratification, whether people have difficulties paying bills. So this is an economic indicator, and again, a similar kind of pattern. So both, again, between nations, but also within nations, kind of like with the example that we had seen in the work from home case, there is clear stratification, not only in the ways people are impacted by technology, the ways people use technology and so on, but also the ways people think about technology and the kinds of perceptions and worries and anxieties that result from that. And I did actually include that slide. That was a simple regression that I did myself in 2020 using survey data from the Austrian Corona Panel survey in Austria and regressing the Freedom Party vote share. And again, apologies that this is in German, but I'll translate it. Regressing the vote share for the Freedom Party in the general elections 2019 on a set of socio-demographic indicator plus an indicator of technology skepticism. And what we did is we just asked the same question as the Eurobarometer had done, namely agreement or disagreement on a Likert scale with the statement that robots and artificial intelligence steal people's jobs. And in this admittedly relatively simplistic model, what you nevertheless find is holding constant educational status, age, gender, and household income, technology skepticism or technology anxiety is strongly predictive of the, of the vote for the Freedom Party. So is, by the way, gender as well, because it's many more male. The Freedom Party has many more male voters, and those among you who maybe Erasmus students, I don't know, the Freedom Party is a right-wing populist party in Austria. So kind of a similar result compared to what Frey argues with regard to Trump. It's debatable, it's open for debate, but I think there is something there. There's something clearly also generally that has to do with that in terms of anxieties about the future, and a generally also psychologically negative sentiments that characterize the electorate of this party and right-wing parties in general. So it may not be 100% specific to technology. People arguably Freedom Party voters are relatively or above average skeptical about many things. But there is, I think, also something arguably substantial about the aspect of technology. What may it have to do with, and this it did not enter the regression, but could enter, theoretically enter the regression. What may have to do with that is, again, the kinds of sectors that people work in. And this now gives you blue lines for those who told us in the survey they voted for the Freedom Party, compared to the red is an indication of whether people think that their job is fully or at least partially automatable. And you see, it's not by no means a perfect correlation, but you see that people who tended to vote in the general elections 2019 for the Freedom Party tend to be more represented in sectors such as commerce, car repair, transport, and so on, industry, the army, and so on, where people also think that that work is automatable, or that the work that they are doing could easily be done by a robot. So they have potentially, although I admit that there are problems of endogeneity here for those who to know what that term means, they may have objective reasons for being anxious about technologies. They may be doing the kinds of routine work that are actually automatable, and that their view that robots steal the people's jobs may at least be potentially true as regards to their own job. Okay, we can discuss more about that in the Q&A. A couple more slides. This one somewhat more uplifting. What we also have also seen. Sorry. During the crisis is not only more anxiety, but also spaces opening up, I think, towards more socially utopian thinking as well. So for instance, and I will just relatively quickly go over that, what we also ask people is whether they favor a so-called universal basic income. So cash transfer that is paid to people regardless of whether they work or not. And whether people would like to see that being introduced in Austria. And at least in the first year of the pandemic, during the first few months, you saw that the appetite of people for such a basic income increased. And I'm sorry, I'll just probably skip over that. Those people who changed their minds were especially in sectors such as public services or the public sector, but also in the IT sector. Nevertheless, what one could say, I think, is that many people made contact, certainly in Austria, with an activistic welfare state, and perhaps for the first time in many cases in their lives became dependent to a degree also on these kinds of transfers. And that may well have shifted their outlook on what is legitimate for a welfare state to do, or what the welfare state should even be required to do. So we had emergency loans, we had a huge short-time work scheme with over 1 million recipients at the peak in the midst of 2020. A lot of subsidies, a lot of unemployment benefits being paid out, bailouts of firms and so on. And this continued through the COVID pandemic, but also now through the energy and inflation crisis that we are seeing in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine. So a lot more a fiscally quite active and interventionist state. So this opened up things into the direction of perhaps more political demand for decommodification, for more social policy making and so on. Okay, final slides. In terms of direct effects on democracy, I think the big questions to be addressed are first around the question whether a society where many work from home, perhaps even exclusively so and permanently so, whether such a society is really compatible with democracy, or whether it somehow needs to adapt and find new ways of making democracy work for that kind of a society and that kind of a workplace. We should call ourselves into memory that work from home used to be the norm for a long time. Pretty much for the history of humanity, until more or less, if we put this very crudely, the Industrial Revolution. Before that, the domestic system or even subsistence systems used to be the norm, where people worked in their own little gardens or backyards, or indeed, of course, on the property of landlords, but still it was not a system where you had factories and big sort of ways of a public engagement. Was a much more domestically oriented society, certainly for many hundreds of years predating the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization then brought urbanization and a whole public sphere, the labor movement, and so on, and new forms of politicization of society and of political organization, which all took sort of inspiration also from the ways industry and mass media and so on were organized. political parties and so on. If you think of that, which work like firms in a way. But also the kind of public spaces even emerged, public roads, public places, and the workplace, of course, and the factory where people interacted with each other and with large groups on a day-to-day basis. So to the extent that this is drawn in, this kind of work model is being drawn into question through the process of digitalization and technological change, there are questions to be asked whether the concept of democracy based in the public sphere is under threat. And I'll conclude with this last bit of data and we'll throw that at you. One of the starkest findings that we've seen in public opinion surveys throughout the last 2 years, and hopefully not a lasting one, but certainly an awfully persistent one, is the erosion of trust in democratic institutions. These are data from Austria, and these are great data, by the way. Many repeated measurements over time, a wonderfully long time period, asking people, all in all, how satisfied or unsatisfied are you with how democracy currently works in Austria? And Austria used to have pretty high levels of democratic satisfaction. And much of this has, or a substantial bit of this has eroded to alarming levels of people in that red category saying they are very dissatisfied with the way democracy works currently in Austria. And people saying they're at least rather dissatisfied with the way democracy works. The people who say they are very, very satisfied are a tiny minority, probably less than 10% at the moment. And also the people who are somewhat in between have eroded. So a lot of discontentment with democracy. Of course, a lot has to do with, does not have much to do with technology, but has to do with the way people think government maybe mishandled the pandemic and the kinds of restrictions on people's freedoms and so on. But there's something also perhaps in more lasting, and given that this has not that easily snapped back to the levels pre-pandemic, even after much restriction was lifted, is an indication that there is something sort of not at ease, something sort of being triggered, a new equilibrium, perhaps, if you will, being found here. Okay, I'll close with concluding slides. I've argued that this crisis, which has become a sort of double crisis of a cost of living crisis plus the pandemic overlaying into each other, merging into each other, and so on. It introduced new forms of work and new labor technologies and new social technologies as well. It revolutionized the adoption of existing technologies. It ushered in new forms of work, and it created new inequalities. And these kinds of crises, we know from history, have catalyzing effects on the structure of labor, and they reorganize the whole society. What kind of people, jobs people do, how they are paid, what is in demand and what isn't. Digitalization, which has been pushed and accelerated by this crisis, has led to new power constellations, new worries about the future, but also perhaps new appetites for social safety, dealing with this kind of burden of adaptation. And I think there's a case to be made for the public sphere to be rethought or reinterrogated in a society of teleworkers, if we want to put it that bluntly. All right,